So field inspection. We got several. How many folks are field inspectors here? Or do it as part of your job? 3 or 4 or 5? All right. And so field inspection is a big part of our construction industry. And there's all kinds of different viewpoints on these things. And I do a lot of inspections. I do third-party inspections. I did the GSA inspection for a couple of buildings here in Washington, D.C. And those inspections are done for various reasons. Obviously, jurisdictional inspections are going to be done for safety and compliance with the code and compliance with permits. And so, whereas other inspections may be done for compliance with a rebate program, for instance. So the utility company may have a program and they have to show compliance. And so some of those programs may actually get into how the system actually performs. From a jurisdictional point of view, quite frankly, the code really doesn't get into performance very much. I mean, in California, we have Title 24, and there's performance-related issues related to that and all, but in general, the code is about safety, public safety, and so you can install a system that's perfectly safe that never works a day in its life, right? And from the standpoint of safety, it's safe. Now, you still may have upset customers, and so that comes in. What's the obligation of the local jurisdiction to call out a contractor who's doing shoddy work on the performance side of things? Okay, well, that's a tough one.
In a lot of cases, you still need your restaurant.
What's that?
In a lot of cases, you still need your restaurant.
Because the SREC may be estimated. So if they're estimated SREC, then I don't care. Well, I personally care, but the person might not. So there's all kinds of reasons for inspections. And certainly, I like to see a system up and operate. I like to see it turn on. And so after doing an inspection, it'd be nice to say, hey, turn the thing on, let's see if it rolls. And then if it goes poof and smoke comes out, then something's wrong. But in general, I'd say most of the inspections are probably done. Everything in the off position, all the disconnects open. And so this is a system that's already been inspected. You can see the displays on and everything like that. And so it's running, but in general, we start with everything. So I've written probably a dozen different inspector checklists over the years, and they all have different priorities and concerns and things like that. And California was writing one for their governor's program. So they had a governor's program for permitting and also include inspection. And so they came up with an 8-page inspection checklist, 8 pages. So I sat down and I read through it, and I timed myself. I read through each item. I got down to the end of it, and it took me 20 minutes to read it. And I go, 15-minute inspection. Took me 20 minutes to read it, not apply it, but read it. That's not going to work. It's got to be 1 page. It's got to be 1 page. Okay. So if it's going to be 1 page, what's the most important issue when we come into a field inspection? And so we're talking about electrical work. There are some basic rules of the road with electrical work, and that is that things be done in a neat and workmanlike manner. It's right in the electrical code, Article 110.12. And if it's not done in a neat and workmanlike manner, it usually means that we have somebody that hasn't done a lot of electrical work. And if they haven't done a lot of electrical work, and this is an electrical system, that would be a concern. And so, right off the bat, that's a negative. If I get out of the truck and I look up on the roof and it's all a big mess, this is not going to go well. If it's all neat and tidy and workmanlike manner, we go, okay, this could go well. But that's that first impression. First impressions mean everything to a field inspector. I mean, we got field inspectors in the room. Can I get an amen on that? Yeah. If the job site's clean, if things are in order, things look good, that's a good feeling. It's a good initial feeling. If it's all a mess, it's like, I got so much to do today. This is not going to be good. So one of the things that I, in teaching contractors, here's a customer's home, there's their front door. They don't have a garage, and so they're going to get out of their car in their driveway, and they're going to walk up their stairs, and they're not going to see the top of the roof. They're not going to see the top of the solar panels with pretty blue colors or anything like that. They get to see the bottom of the array, and if that array doesn't look good, they're going to see that every single day, and that's just going to be over and over again. And if you got stuff hanging down, snow and ice we talked about earlier, it's going to get caught on that stuff. It's going to rip wires loose. We were doing a little, it wasn't even an inspection, it was just kind of a visit to a site in upstate New York. I actually grew up in upstate New York, not far from this place. It was a skating rink. And so we go out and take a look at this place, and I'm like, what are all those wires hanging down? And it's like, what had happened was the structural engineers, this was a Butler building, big Butler building, skating rink, and metal structure. The structural engineers didn't want the array near the peak because of the loading on the roof. So they put the array about halfway down the roof. It was like right in the middle of the roof, halfway down the roof. And what happened was all the snow and ice and everything like that kept traveling down the roof, and just flowed underneath that array. Lots and lots of volume. This is upstate New York. And literally all the wires were torn loose on the array. I mean, they were just frayed, ripped loose out of the back of the modules. The array didn't work very well, if at all, and certainly would have been pretty scary to work on, just because the wires are just hanging all over the place. So there's some real safety reasons why we don't want to see that stuff hanging down. Debris captures debris. Incidentally, we did have a fire in Greenbelt, the Greenbelt fire we called it. Kind of catchy. And at the Greenbelt fire, this was a 48-volt system that caught on fire. It's the only 48-volt system in history that I've ever seen catch on fire. But it was a house that was kind of backed up against a forest up in Greenbelt, and squirrels had made huge nests underneath this thing, and they chewed through the wires, and eventually those chewed through wires arced enough to actually start a fire. And the house didn't burn down, because the roof actually protected it. The fire service got there in time. They got the fire out. But it was an example of the fact that debris had collected under the system for years and years and years. There were actually trees growing out of the gutters because they had so much debris in the gutters. Because this house wasn't very well maintained, and so those things can and do happen. So here's some examples of some pretty crazy wiring and what people do sometimes. Another thing when we're doing an inspection, is kind of one of the simple things we can do is just count the number of modules. Because we got a permit, and the permit was for 24 modules or whatever the number is, 30 modules from our experience, from our examples here. And so it's pretty easy for me to go down and count the modules and see if I've got the same number as was in the permit. Because if I don't have the same number of modules on the roof that were on the permit, what's the problem? Calculations could be wrong. I'm the field inspector. My job is to do what? Make sure that it matches what was approved, right? So somebody sat down, they approved a set of plans, and I'm just out there to see if that's exactly, did they do that? They specified wire sizes, specified the modules, they specified the inverter. Is that what's there? And is it put together right? Right? I got 15 minutes, and that's pretty much what I can do in those 15 minutes. And so, so a simple count. On a residential system, a simple count works. On a 10 megawatt plant, simple count does not work. I lose count every time. 4,200, what? Phone rings, dang it. No. So, no. I've never counted a big system before, personally. It looks like a lot of modules to me. The biggest system I've ever been on, 7 million modules. 7 million modules. The array was 10 miles by 10 miles. 550 megawatts. It's in near Joshua Tree. Yeah. Biggest array, biggest array in the United States.
They got a lot of room out there.
They do have a lot of room. You drive up to it and it looks like there's a lake. You got a lake out there. It's like, oh, what a pretty lake. And you keep driving, it's like, that's not a lake. That's a PV array. And then it takes about a half an hour to drive from one end of the array to the other end of the array. Okay, here's a lovely picture. And so so this is where some of the discussion about codes, covenants, and restrictions comes up in planning departments, and we got to make sure the planning department's okay with the PV system and all that. Well, this array right here breaks all the rules from a structural point of view. And so, regardless of whether it blows away or not, the fact is that it doesn't follow the rules. And the rules are strict about that, and they keep things in the plane of the roof and things like that, which makes the system look far better. And this is an eyesore. This is actually the second installation they did on this. The first one was worse. But you can't blame them for trying. I don't know, but you can actually. And so the other part of this is that there's not another PV system within, I don't know, at least a mile of this location, because anybody who drives by here every day, you've planted in their brain firmly that you have to be out of your mind to do solar on your house, right? Because if it looks like that, I ain't putting that on my house. And no person in their right mind would do that on their own house. And so, I mean, if this was my neighbor's house, I'd be exceedingly upset. I've told people, what if this was my neighbor, I'd probably wait for them to go on vacation. I would dismantle the system, stick it in the backyard, put a little sign on it that says, no.
Probably electrical engineer.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, those guys are just crazy. Here's some examples of right and wrong flashing. There is roofing involved with this process, so making sure that the structural connections according to a plan. So this happens to be a pretty special roofing product and requires special roof flashing with it. This is not a special roofing product; it's an asphalt shingle, and they didn't get the non-special flashing installed correctly, and so. That's just an indication of lack of experience, lack of training, the wrong people doing the work, and then it turned out that this particular installation had a dozen major flaws in it, and this was just one of them. Of course, you see wires hanging down. You see that. The rails they have here had the wrong clips on the wrong rails, so they actually had two types of rails on the roof. And the clips were swapped between the two rails, not designed for the clips they were using. They had the wrong types of disconnects. You just went down the list. It was just craziness. And ultimately, it was because, a couple people were put in a truck with a bunch of stuff. They were sent out in the field with no training. Maybe they said they were trained. Oh, yeah, I took this training class. Yeah, it's like solar or something or other. Yeah, and so they took this training class, and so the owner of the company, who actually had done quite a few installations in the past, and in general they were pretty good. None of the systems were nearly as bad as this one, and it's like they never trained the crew, and you get what you get. You do have to be trained to do this stuff, and the equipment that we use is unique. It's not the same, and it does require a level of skill. Here's an example. So we have exposed cables, and one of the real challenges with exposed cables is properly securing them, preventing physical damage, things like that. We sleeve cables when there's a possibility of exposed to physical damage, and certainly having an exposed cable laying on an asphalt shingle roof that's very abrasive would be an example of physical damage. I think everybody So we could run a raceway in between these rails, but using the attic ventilator to support the conductors, just, no, I don't think so. It's held in place with the ground wire. It's also run across there, so that's helpful. That's helpful. It's like a messenger wire. Yeah, no. Yeah, and this is all completely visible from ground level. I mean, you just stand there, look up, and you go, why would anybody do that? And so, you know, and so part of this is training over time. And one of the encouraging things is that as we see, as a industry matures in a region, a location, the installs get better in general. That's in general. But we also have cases where when things get busy, the quality goes down because people bring in folks that haven't been trained. And so there's always this struggle, and that's why we have an inspection community. That's why we do inspections, is because people don't always follow the rules. They don't always pay attention. And even the best hearted people can screw up and not keep their quality up. And so, but, you know, the good news is I've been to a lot of sites where one installation went in 2002 and the other installation went in 2008. Dramatically different quality in the two installations. So I would say in general, nationally, we've had definitely an improvement. But again, every new area that opens up is a potential for issues, and you got to stay on people. You know, that's when I talk to contractors. Don't get upset with your inspectors. Work with your inspectors. Come to an agreement on what needs to be done, and get it done, and then keep your quality up. Because if you let it slide, they're gonna take it. They should be taking you to task on it.
There's also not a lot of code guidance on wire management.
Yeah. Yeah, your basic guidance is don't expose it to physical damage. That's kind of a general thing in the code. And so one of the challenges, and the reason this is not an easy thing and why there's a tendency for quality to slip, is that the wiring that we're given on these panels is typically designed so that it can wire modules in landscape and portrait. And so it gives you extra wire to make it for the landscape arrangement. And because of that, in portrait, which is by far the more common way of installing on residential rooftops, we end up having a lot of extra wire. And so you actually, it's challenging, and this is maybe not the best example of that, but this is pretty decent to get rid of that extra wire, make it so that it is maintainable. So if we had to take something apart, we could cut the wire ties, we could take it apart, unplug it, and then put it back together, reinstall the wire ties, things like that. And from the ground, you can't see any of these wires. They all disappear. It's nice and clean up underneath the array. And look, right across the street, you see another array, because that whole street has got a bunch of systems on it, because neighbors talk to neighbors, and they looked at it and say, oh, I wouldn't mind that being on my roof. And what's your electric bill? Okay. So, you know, that's how solar gets in and large.
Well, I was just wondering, is that some kind of like homemade wire nut that they did to the ground in there or something?
Maybe.
Moving along.
Moving right along. So he's like, well, he's an inspector. See, look at that. Is that acceptable grounding and bonding? We'd have to look at the installation instructions and see if that was okay. Probably not. Will it work? It's two stainless washers in the ground. This is actually the grounding point on the sun power module. So the question is this the right method? And the answer is probably not here, but they probably they're in the right hole on that particular one. Which is, here's my perspective on this. This is a great example. I would like to not run that stupid wire because it's silly. It's absurd. I've got this piece of aluminum that's equivalent to, I don't know, 250 kc mil conductor, at least, going all the way down the roof. what benefit am I going to get out of a piece of copper running along with aluminum? Copper erodes aluminum anyway. Bad idea. So why not bond everything to this aluminum and then put a lug on that? And that's what 2703 does for us. Gets rid of these stupid ground wires all over the systems. And particularly in a high corrosion environment like you have here in the Chesapeake Bay and stuff like that, copper and aluminum do not like each other. Copper just tears the heck out of aluminum. Very different.
All modular, tubular type stuff that just seems to go, you know, they lay out wham bam think man type of thing. So it's really slick type that.
Correct. These are older pictures for sure.
Okay.
But because they're older pictures, they also illustrate what is common with systems that are not well organized. So I mean, what you're talking about is a well thought out system that's gone through a UL 2703. It's been designed from the get-go to make it easy for the installer to ground it. This was, you know, in an interim. In fact, you know, SunPower was groundbreaking by putting their grounding hole on the edge of the module. Nobody had ever thought about doing that before. That was crazy. You always put the ground lug in the middle of the back of the module where you can't get to it. Because that's what makes sense. But why did we put it there? Well, because everything used to be up on racks on, you know, ground-mounted systems. It was not intended for rooftop-mounted systems. And so this was kind of the first rooftop module. Now, they might have used the wrong hardware there, but it was way easier to do that than to, we'll see some examples of grounding hardware in other places. Conduit installed properly. Lots of, you know, here's an example of a piece of flex just running across the roof. You know, I call that a pool contractor. Did that. I did all the electrical for my pool and all of my plumbing for my pool. Because I wouldn't trust a pool contractor. Okay, so here's Firefighter access. We talked about rig and size and things like that, and these are things that are in the 2012 building code and fire code. And they're fairly conservative, and as I said, the 2018 is actually less conservative and easier to enforce. But here's an example of a 3-foot gap. This house had a fire on it. It was in the garage burned down. The array was still operational. It didn't get in their way, so they were able to do their operations. Here's fire ratings. So these two are fire ratings, documentation related to fire ratings. And so there are probably a couple dozen products now in the market that have fire ratings on their systems, and that includes the rail, the rack, and the module. A typical listing label for a module, just for the. So in the old school listing labels, with often your typical glass module would have a Class C rating on it, and that's going to work in most of the United States. However, California requiring Class A, we needed to have these system ratings, which is a whole other story. This is grounding hardware. We saw some examples of probably wrong grounding hardware. Actually, there's something missing here. So I think it's one of the pictures that we just saw. But here's how this might have been the right grounding hardware. But even with the right grounding hardware, you can see how ugly it can look. And so you got a number 6 cable, a number 6 conductor, bare copper running down the array. Very difficult to train that up in the right way to make it look clean and neat. And you see this all the time. It's horrible. Looks bad, catches debris. Here up here at the top is a weed clip. That's a bonding clip, and that thing. Many other products like it that have been used to create these bonding systems to bond the modules to the rail, so you don't have to have all these wires hanging all over the place. Equipment marked. Listed and installed according to the approved plan. Inverters, you typically see utility interactive on the inverter. If it's an inverter that's been designed to work with the grid, here's an example of the information on that. Conductors, cable sizes and markings according to approved plan. THWN wire used outside of conduit. It's not sunlight resistant. Do we see that very often? Not very often anymore, but I guarantee you folks that were not familiar or not familiar with how to do PV installations are going to do that. A lot of people say, well, it's because electricians are not doing the work. And I've seen some of the worst installations from electricians in PV systems, not because they weren't good electricians. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. It's because they weren't trained. It was not common materials for them. PV wire, if you're an electrician, you've never heard of PV wire. What is that? And so I got some number 10 wire in the truck. You want me to run number 10 up there? I guess I can do that. But so you'd see that kind of stuff in the field. But, you know, correct ratings and stuff like that, understanding what the equipment is. With a little bit of training, an electrician will always be a superior installer when it comes to electrical work on a PV system with the right information, but with the wrong information, you get what you get. Fuses, if we have fuses in our system, most of our residential systems no longer have fuses in them. Those have all gone away, but on our commercial systems, we'll have fuses. And of course, they might be 600 volt rated fuses. They might be 1,000 volt DC rated fuses. So we got to pay attention. Hopefully, it's right on the barrel of the fuse. Often is. Now, 2014 code requires, and later requires that fuses be PV listed, which is an additional listing beyond just being DC listed. Okay. Here's an example of a Class R fuse. It's got a 600 volt rating on it. A nice big number there. But if you look at the fine print, it's only rated for 300 volts DC. And so that was a common field mistake because these are readily available Class R fuses, and the 600 volt fuses were more expensive and special order. Disconnects according to approved plan. We have to see the DC disconnect, the AC disconnect. Here's an example where the utility required a visible break switch. The code would not require this switch to be installed. It doesn't require this switch if there's a circuit breaker right there. So the circuit breaker could easily be the switch. So the only reason that disconnect is there is because the utility requires it. Correct. So this is a case of a load side connection. So it's going into a circuit breaker. But you're correct. If this is on the supply side of the connection, if it happens to be going in and picking up the supply side of the conductor between the main disconnect and the meter, then this would be a fuse disconnect. And that would be the right location for it. And it could also be the visible break switch for the utility. They could get both out of it. Now sometimes the utility says, I don't want a fuse switch there. I'm going to require you to do a non-fuse switch. And it's like, why do you care whether it has fuses in it or not? The code requires me to have fuses in it. And you need a visible break. So let's all get on the same team here, and I get fuses, you get this visible break. And but I mean, people come up with rules, and so it's on a piece of paper, and you're looking through it, and it says unfused switch. Oh, you got a fused switch. I'm failing you. It's like, what? Anyway, that's a whole nother story. So, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pyrene spring.
Well, it's the fire guys, don't they want it because they want to, I mean, if you've got an AC disconnect that you can switch off outside the house and you can pull the plug outside the house, then you don't have any power, right? You can
right.
Fire or whatever, do whatever you need to do.
Well, that's great if you're actually doing what you think you're doing. The purpose of this switch that we're talking about here is about utility companies. It has nothing to do with firefighters. Now, the firefighter might be able to use that same switch now that we have rapid shutdown. Okay? But prior to rapid shutdown, that switch does absolutely nothing to improve safety. Yes. Right. So for a DC system like this, a string inverter system like this, pulling the AC switch does zero for safety. All it does is stop the flow of current, but your voltage is still there everywhere. Now, what he said is, in the case of a microinverter system, when you pull that AC switch, it happens to turn off all the inverters, which does make things safer. But the vast majority of the systems, you know, until a few years ago, were string inverter systems. So the firefighter thought they did something. They would come along here and turn that switch off, and they thought they turned off the system. Oh, and then they had another switch here, and they turned that switch off. And then they thought they did something. Neither one did anything to improve safety. Every piece of wire you have in this system is fully energized. Okay? The only piece of wire that got de-energized is the wire from here to here. That's it. Everything else is fully energized. Even the DC would stay energized for 5 minutes. Okay? And so that's what we had to get in the head of the firefighters. The firefighters, just give me a switch. Totally reasonable request. I'd love to give you a switch. In fact, I'll give you a switch. It's just not going to do anything.
And then they set their big lights up.
Yeah. Now you can get a little bit of voltage off of lights. I'm not super worried about that, but it can happen. But yeah. But the reality is, if you really want to improve safety of the firefighters, you got to do it in a comprehensive manner, and that's what because they were going to put this in the fire code in 2012. Rooftop disconnect required for every PV system. And so I talked to the guy who was putting the requirement in, and I said, listen, here's why. I wrote him a 4-page document that this is why you cannot make that a requirement, because it's not going to do anything of what you think it's going to do. And all it's going to do is cause a problem in the field, because firefighters will think they're going to turn something off and they're not, and they're going to get shocked. And then everybody's going to be upset. So let's actually comprehensive deal with it. And that's what rapid shutdown is. It's a comprehensive method of dealing with the process that actually turns stuff off rather than not doing anything. So anyway, disconnects are there for a reason. You know, we have disconnects for, these disconnects are for servicing the inverters. Purpose is, hey, inverters fail. You know, we got to work on them.
So that's a DC.
So this is a DC disconnect over here. This is an AC disconnect over here. We also probably have a circuit breaker in there, and we could flip either one. Now, if I had that switch sitting next to me, I'm not even going to bother with the circuit breaker inside. I'm just going to open that switch because that's the visible one that I can see. And it's also got a lockability to it. I could actually lock it in the off position if I wanted to. Particularly if it's not located where the inverters is. Now, in general, Article 690 requires us to have the switch for disconnecting equipment to be within sight of the equipment. Okay? So there's our DC disconnect there. Unfortunately, the AC disconnect on this particular system was on the outside of the house. This is in a utility room on the other side of the wall, but I can't see that switch from there. So if I'm working on this inverter, I would have to go outside and open that switch. But if I don't lock it off, I'm in big trouble. Because what would happen is you have this door on the outside of the house. The homeowner comes home from work. They come home early. They come home at lunch. Okay? You're working on the system. You're doing some rewire on the AC side. Switch is off. Door's open. The homeowner goes, oh, the stupid neighbor kids, they're playing pranks on me again, turned off my solar system. This happens. I mean, people, you know, whatever. There's a switch. It's on. Oh, I can turn it off. Great. Well, you happen to be on the other end of that switch. They turn it, they energize it, and you're in big trouble. So that's why switches in general in the electrical code are required to be within sight of the equipment. And industrial facilities and OSHA requirements allow for lockout tagout. That's a completely different story. Basic code requirements are within sight. Okay? And a lot of contractors are upset about that. And they go, wait a minute. This is just right on the other side of the wall.
And well, it's lockable.
Yeah, and it's lockable. Yeah. Well, the code doesn't trust people, I guess. Inverter output circuit is located at the opposite end of the bus from the utility supply. So basically, there's a little warning sign that do not relocate that device. These are the labels for the DC power source. Almost all, if not all, of our DC switches are going to have warning electric shock hazard. Terminals on both line and load may be energized in the open position. That's because when we open a DC switch, we we've got PV on one side. If it's daylight, that side's energized. And on the other side of the switch, we typically have an inverter like this. It's got a bunch of capacitors in it, and it could take up to 5 minutes to de-energize it. And so you want to make sure that at least the electrician's given some kind of a warning, whether they read it or not. You put your screwdriver on the low side of that switch, and you didn't wait for the amount of time or whatever, you didn't check to make sure that the voltage was down, you're going to get hit. So that's what that sign's about. This is the AC sign for the current and voltage. Now we get a higher voltage, obviously, three-phase system there. Here's a lovely picture. I love this one. So the homeowner didn't like all those red signs on their stuff. That was kind of really not very pretty. Did not match the motif of the house. And so when they had the whole house stuccoed, at least they put masking over the meters, but they basically stuccoed right over all the signs and everything. So not so much. People do the darndest things. Connection to the grounding electrode. So typically, we're normally connecting into the electrical panel. A lot of jurisdictions, I'm sure, around here, if you're doing anything on the electrical side of the system, they're going to require you to drive another ground rod, at least have 2 ground rods 6 feet apart. Is that pretty common around here? And so that's so that if people have ground rods that are not that great, or maybe they had a water pipe ground or something like that, this is going to improve their grounding electrode system. Access and working space. This is really common, especially when we have, whether we have meters on the outside of the house, if we put the inverter out there. A lot of folks like to plant vegetation in front of our meters and stuff like that because they're just trying to cover it up. It's outlandish, you know, it's ugly. Aesthetics, they're trying to make a, well, they got banana trees here, so you need a machete to get to the equipment. Pretty common. That happens all the time. Here's an example of a battery system. We're going to talk about battery systems after our break. And this is a really common thing that we found in the field where you want to keep your batteries really close to your inverters. There's really good reasons for that. Keep your induction and your conductors down, your voltage drop down in those conductors. You're pulling big current on these wires. But it was really challenging to set it up so that you had access to the equipment. And the only way to access this particular equipment to work on it is it appears that they've given you some room to stand inside the battery box. You just got to watch the back of your legs a little bit there. You've got some open conductors there. So could get a little exciting, especially if you sat down. So anyway, yeah, that's just not the way to do it. But it does require thought, and so you just can't throw these systems in. You got to kind of think it all through and say, okay, battery box is going to go there, the inverter is going to go there, gives me my 30-inch wide access 3 feet back. I've got all that stuff, because if you don't pay attention to it, you'll never get right.
So is that fan at the bottom for the ventilation?
That appears to be a ventilation fan of some sort. Who knows?
Pull the hydrogen gas. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing about hydrogen gas, and you know, I'm just going to call that a cooling fan for when you're working on a hot day.
Right.
Because this vent right here is probably more than adequate for atmospheric ventilation for that room. Hydrogen is exceedingly difficult to contain to toxic levels. And that's because it doesn't go up or down, it just goes everywhere. So you say, well, this is sealed up here. This gases are going to go up here and form a cloud. And it's like, no, hydrogen goes everywhere. So that's one of its benefits. But if you do a really good job of sealing it, that's what you don't want to do. Like if you have a battery box like this, you don't want to put a big gasket around it and seal it, you know, unless you've got open ventilation all the time to the outside. Because you can, absolutely, if you seal it well enough, you can create an explosive mixture in there. And if you had a circuit breaker in there or something like that and it popped, boom. Okay, rapid shutdown system installed according to approved plan. So here's an example of this would be like a microinverter system. And so I've given you some voltage levels just to give you an example of how much voltage this system might have. What's in green when it's turned off would be down to 30 volts or less. What's yellow is 80 volts or less. And then what's red is above 80 volts. So we don't see anything red here in this particular example. And so let's say this is a microinverter system. We turn off a circuit breaker in the main panel down here. That turns off the AC line. That AC line goes all the way down the array. And now the modules just have their open circuit voltage, which might be 40 or 50 volts on them. And that's all that's left. That's the only voltage that's left in the system. And so the conductors leaving the array are clearly down below 30 volts, which is the basic requirement of the 2014 code. 2017 code after January 1 is going to require this lower hazard array. This particular sign is for the 2014 code, essentially. It's in the 2017 code, but it would comply with the requirements right now in the 2017 code and the 2014 code, which is conductors leaving the array are shut down, but the conductors within the array would remain energized in sunlight. There's a yellow sign which basically talks about reduced hazard within the array. Same basic look of the sign. So. And we could spend a lot of time on rapid shutdown. I'm going to go on time today. Like I said, there's articles out there. I've written an article for a couple different periodicals on this stuff. And encourage you to read through those articles. And happy to talk to you guys offline. Any specific questions you have? I mean, we have advisors for communities, and as those advisors get questions that are more difficult or more specific on some of these issues, they can refer them on to me, and I'm more than happy to chat with any jurisdictions that are running into questions of how to enforce the code, because it can be quite difficult. As I mentioned just recently, and this was not in a jurisdiction not far from here. Anybody here from Anne Arundel County? Good, we can talk about it. Okay. Anyway, this happened to be Anne Arundel, but they were, they don't have a lot of PV in Anne Arundel County, and so, they're trying to figure out what are the rules and trying to apply the code, and so it's understandable the struggle, because the code isn't super specific about a lot of things, and so. One of the resources that's out there is the ICODES, the International Code Council, has a document, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's basically, it's a compilation of all the solar-related codes in one document. And they're going, they want to charge you $80 or $100 for it, whatever it is. But one of the advantages is it's got every section of the code that's related to PV, and both the National Electrical Code, the Residential Code, Building Code, and Fire Code. And the green code, I think. So I think it's got all of them in there. So it's a nice resource, and it's some kind of solar energy compendium or something like that that they have out there. And so that might not be a bad choice to actually just to look through what the International Code Council says are the relevant sections of the code. Because what we run into in the field is that we'll get a jurisdiction that starts referencing all these other parts of the code and trying to apply them to, say, a ground-mounted system when they're clearly related to buildings and safety in buildings. It's like, they're not the same thing. So